Thanks, Pia, and thanks, everyone. It is a great honor and privilege to be asked to give this opening lecture to you all this evening in this beautiful setting. So thank you very, very much for having me. My name is Ian. I'm a criminologist at Maynooth University in Ireland, and I'm going to talk a little bit about recent developments in the European legal framework, some of the key messages from those aspects of the European framework which have been adopted by all of your jurisdictions, and then thinking a little bit about the implications of that legal framework and also of recent developments in some countries for implementing restorative justice in criminal justice. Please feel free to contact me at any time. I'm happy for my slides to be shared. My email address is there. If anyone has any questions, I will also be here with you all week, but I'm happy to continue the conversation later if I can be of any help to anyone. So this is Maynooth University, where I'm fortunate to work in Ireland. It's a very nice place. You know, we're very lucky in my department. The School of Law and Criminology is over in the older, picturesque side of the campus. It's not quite as nice as here, maybe, but we do have alcohol on site, so that's one. In English, we say swings and roundabouts in that respect. So you're all welcome to visit anytime. Several members of the audience have been there before. Please do reach out. It's very easy for us to host researchers, host practitioners. If you would like to come, it is likely that that is something we can organize. So please do feel free to be in touch about that. My work is applied in nature, so I do a lot of research, but usually it is action research where we are studying something to do with the development of restorative justice or restorative practice in some way. Separately to that, I'm asked to speak about the legal framework sometimes because I worked for the Council of Europe to draft the 2018 recommendation on restorative justice in criminal matters and have since then been involved in other kind of Council of Europe work, including on an advisory group on the 2023 recommendation on victim support. And then the work I do now at the European level is with the European Forum for Restorative Justice, where we've been engaged in a long process of advocacy around revisions to the EU Victims' Rights Directive, and I'll talk a little bit about some of that later. I'm also going to talk to you about two other broad areas of work. One is around the implementation of restorative justice. For a number of years, I was involved in the coordination of a project, Strategies for Change, and we've just finished evaluating that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the learnings from that for implementation. And then more recently, I've been involved in a number of projects where we are using restorative practices in other aspects of criminal justice beyond victim offender work. So I'll speak to you a little bit about some of that later as well. But first of all, I wanted to thank my Nordic friends here because I am a progressively minded criminologist in the Anglo-American world, and therefore I am very grateful to the Nordic. Why might that be? Why do you think I would be so grateful to you all for, as someone with that identity?
Nordic exceptionalism.
Nordic exceptionalism? What do you mean by that?
Well, it's a long story.
In our context, what does that look like?
It's a thesis,
Yeah?
that the Nordic nations, that they shorter prison sentences,
Mm-hmm.
more humane conditions than the Anglo world.
That's very true. Yes. So when you talk to people about progressive criminal justice reform in the Anglo-American world, sometimes people say something like, oh, like, did I see that in Norway prisons are kind of nice? And that's when you think, okay, here we go. Look, there's limits to that, of course, but then you can say, yes, well, we can have a conversation about that. So do you know this? What is this film? The Jungle Book? I want to be like you. Not because the Nordic region is perfect, although as a big Arsenal fan, I'm very grateful for Martin Odegaard and Freddie Ljungberg, of course. Also, unusually for someone from the Anglo-American world, I'm a big fan of ski jumping. Do you know who this is? I hope the Finns know. This is Jani Ahonen. So I grew up, I'm Canadian, my family's Canadian, and a very good family friend from Montreal was a ski jumper, Jacques Charland. And when we moved to Europe, we got the luxury of having the Eurosport channel. Now, he was in Canada, so we would record all the ski jumping and the four hills and the ski flying and everything on VHS, mail him over the VHSs growing up. And so, Jani Ahonen was a big part of my childhood, the Hautamaki brothers and so on. Anyone that would beat Martin Schmidt, we were very happy with in my house. But I think more than just this, the dynamic or the state of being in which Nordic criminal justice is in some ways progressive compared to the rest of Western Europe or many other areas, certainly in the Anglo-American world. What the Nordic example shows us, I think, is the process of change is something that can happen intentionally. We can intentionally move from one situation to a very different situation in criminal justice. Nils Christie, a Nordic gentleman, was a big part of my criminological upbringing. And I'm going to pick on Finland to give these examples. What Nils showed in his book, Crime Control as Industry, was not simply that there could be a thesis of Nordic exceptionalism, but in the country Finland, this was not something that was always the case or happened by accident, but rather there was a concerted political alignment, an intentional decision-making process to reduce the use of imprisonment, to increase the threshold for sending someone to prison, and to introduce different forms of justice. This book, which came out in, I want to say 2003, something like that, so it goes up to the late 90s here. So I went on the World Prison Brief and pulled, I don't know what happened here, maybe a little bit of something going on there, but we are still at a point where in Finland, despite having a very high imprisonment rate in living memory, remains at a very low imprisonment rate, even by Western and Northern European standards. Okay? Now, as was mentioned before, in the early 20th century, there was some kind of Russian influence. And I point to Estonia as a country, which also has been intentionally trying to move away from one approach to criminal justice towards another. And if you were to go on the World Prison Brief and look at the Estonian imprisonment rate, you would see a quite dramatic decline in the last 30 years as a result of intentional political decision-making and alignment. This is a gentleman called Priit Kama. Estonia is a country that was involved in restorative justice strategies for change. I've done a lot of work there. And Priit was the head of the prison probation service for quite a long time. And here he says, culturally, Finland is an important partner of ours regarding the correctional system. Scandinavians have prison services we look up to. They're a good example of what ours can be in the future. So again, it is not simply the state of having a progressive system that is an important inspiration to other countries, but the process of moving from a system that is incredibly regressive to one which is intentionally more progressive. And even Irish ministers, and as you probably know, people in the Anglo-American world, can be quite difficult to convince that there are things going on in other parts of the world that might be of interest to them. Although Ireland is very outward-looking, I'm very fortunate to be there now after spending 20 years in the UK, I'll tell you that. But you hosted our former Justice Minister just a few years ago to come and look at some of your open prisons here in Finland. Said it's the jewel in the crown of Finland's penal system. The Minister for Justice, Charlie Flanagan, has said Ireland can learn from the Finns' example. Okay? So you have a lot, the world looks up to you, right? You have a lot of stuff going on that is not just the state of being, but the process of how you get there, that is really important in the story that we, in other parts of the world, tell ourselves and our colleagues and our those with whom we're in conflict about what it is we want to do and where it is we want to go. So, that is among the reasons why I'm very happy to be here and why stuff like this is really important. Because again, it is not about the state of having a relatively progressive system, but the process of continuing that, which I think is what you guys are hopefully going to be contributing to this week. So for the next probably 20 or so minutes, I will give a few messages from the European legal framework. I will talk about some recent developments in restorative justice implementation, both victim offender work and also broader applications of restorative outside of just the criminal procedure. And in so doing, I'm making a couple of assumptions about the feeling in the room. I'm assuming we have a consensus on these grounds. First of all, there's a shared interest in maximizing the accessibility of restorative justice. Is that fair to say? Yes. And secondly, that there is a shared interest in maximizing what I've called the restorativeness of criminal justice more broadly. Is that true? Okay. Well, hopefully what I have to say will be appropriate. And in other words, we believe that positive change can still be done on purpose, as your region has proved in the past. I'm going to make two arguments in doing so. First of all, that taking restorative justice to the next level, irrespective of what level it is in your country, taking it to the next level requires a new form, a new level of inclusive collaboration between organizations. Restorative justice is something which, perhaps unusually, or perhaps not unusually, requires there to be a certain alignment and the participation of a large number of components of the criminal justice process. And its implementation, I argue, requires a significant amount of collaboration between those organizations. Secondly, I will argue that everyone who works in criminal justice can encourage or support citizens to experience that justice as restorative. Or what my colleague Gert-Jan Slump from the Netherlands talks about is agents of restoration. Every police officer, judge, and so on, whether or not you are personally facilitating victim offender work or enabling that to happen through a referral or awareness-raising exercise, you can operate in a more or in a restorative way. And those are all assertions that are supported by the European legal framework. So I'm not going to focus too much on the 2018 Council of Europe recommendation because many of you have heard me discuss this before and because we've moved on a little bit since then anyway. But I'll talk a bit about Council of Europe and the European Union. So, first of all, I have a question. So, some of your countries, at least, have national restorative justice providers. Or in other words, in theory, restorative justice could be offered at every point in the system in every part of the country in some of your countries. Is that right? Okay. But in those countries, restorative justice is offered in a very small proportion of cases still. Okay. So, why do we not have a system which automatically refers all cases? That's a question. If you guys want to answer that, that would be great. What we've learned from, a few decades of research in restorative justice implementation is that you can have services in every part of the country. You can have services that can attend to all different types of crime, that operate at every stage of the process, and still, those services will access a tiny proportion, right? A fraction of the possible cases where restorative justice might be applicable, where it might help to meet needs. Now, of course, you will accept that huge proportion of people who enter the criminal justice system will not want to participate in restorative justice. Maybe even a majority, right? Maybe even a majority. of people will not want to do some form of restorative justice, defined as victim-offender dialogue, and that's fine, right? We absolutely accept that. But what I propose is that you, as the restorative justice practitioner, are the only person who is able to give people really that opportunity to decide if restorative justice is right for them. Every single country that has even high levels of restorative justice use, very low levels of restorative justice use, the potential of those services has not been reached because of the gatekeeping function that we build into the restorative justice process. Restorative justice is something which is very, very difficult to explain if you've never been trained to use it. It is something which, if you are a police officer or a judge, you have a million things to be thinking about and doing. And so expecting that those practitioners are going to be best placed, not that they're not well placed to have some conversations, but assuming that they are best placed is probably not going to cut it. And we see this in research all across the continent. This gatekeeping role having such an effect that means that most people who could potentially want to participate in restorative justice effectively are not given that opportunity. So the language that we're moving towards now, I think, should be around the right to access restorative justice. And what that looks like, in my view, is the right to an individual assessment. This is language that is used in other parts of the European legal framework, the right to individual assessment by the restorative justice provider. That does not mean there is pressure on people to participate. That does not mean that the referral automatically, there's an assumption that restorative justice will go ahead, or negative inferences should be taken if it doesn't go ahead. That means that we have to recognize that the restorative justice provider has to have that opportunity to speak to people about, this is what restorative justice would look like in your situation. Would you like to do that? If not, that's fine. If so, we can arrange that for you. In this paper, which I won't go into too much detail, but just with an Estonian colleague, he and I just kind of tried to conceptualize this a little bit, looking at how the right to restorative justice might derive from other rights in the European Convention on Human Rights, such as the right to an effective remedy. And indeed, one aspect of the European framework which really isn't discussed that much, but a few years ago, the European Commission published a report called the Milquet Report, where a judge talked about the development of victims' rights in the European context and noted that it was to the victim's advantage for all cases where the person would likely receive a prison sentence up to 5 years. It was the victim's advantage for restorative justice to be offered straight away instead of the normal process if they wanted it. I think that's really important because I think politically it's very difficult to, you make the case that obviously diversion is potentially to the benefit of the perpetrator. But what I think people still don't really understand is that this is to the advantage of the person who's been harmed as well. So very briefly, starting with the 2018 recommendation, the purpose was to enhance the awareness, development, and use of restorative justice, to talk about standards in a more balanced way than the European Union's Victims' Rights Directive, which talks about safeguards for victims but not for perpetrators, to integrate a broader understanding of restorative justice and its principles, thinking about all of those areas where restorative thinking, restorative principles could influence criminal justice outside of simply victim-offender work in the criminal procedure. And finally, thinking about the use of restorative justice post-sentence with serious crime as well. To quote the commentary, it goes further than the previous recommendation in calling for a broader shift in criminal justice across Europe towards a more restorative culture and approach in criminal justice systems. So not just the availability of victim-offender dialogue. But how can other aspects of criminal justice, whether that's victim support, whether that's community service, whether that's diversion in cases where there is no direct victim of a crime, how can those be informed by restorative principles? Some key points in terms of restorative justice: it calls for a generally available service at all stages of the process, in all parts of the country, irrespective of the type of crime. I know that's very important for some people in the room. This is not saying, well, you've got to, there are some types of crime where this can never be appropriate. That's not what the European legal framework says. The European legal framework says this could potentially be appropriate. That there should be dedicated coordination by multi-agency partnerships where all of the organizations that have a role to play in making restorative justice happen also have a role to play in the coordination and governance of that. They have a responsibility to ensure that it happens. And there should be dedicated staff in organizations to support that. There are also practice standards, which, as I say, compared to the Victims' Rights Directive in the EU, which was just about safeguards for victims of crime. No, that's okay. This is the practice standards that apply to everyone who would participate in the process. And then, as I say, other applications of restorative principles. So, informing other interventions, victim support interventions where maybe the perpetrator is not involved, or indeed diversionary or community service interventions where a victim is not involved. Addressing harm outside of the criminal procedure. So, complaints against the police, for example, conflicts in prison. And also building relationships and a restorative culture in organizations. That is something that in the school sector, people talk about restorative practices as a kind of a proactive thing that you can do. Thinking about how people relate to each other within professional settings, but also the relationships between you as a professional and the citizens that you're working with. So in effect, anything restorative that you might want to do is supported by the current European legal framework to which your governments have adopted, So since then, there have been a few further developments within the Council of Europe. The first significant one was the Venice Declaration in 2021, agreed by all Council of Europe justice ministers. And I will point to one key element of this, which is the development of national action plans. So there should be a process, the Council of Europe asserts, and all your ministers have agreed, a national process where all of the players, right, that's every single organization that plays a role in the criminal procedure, victim support organizations, civil society, researchers, should all play a role in coming together to decide what needs to happen for restorative justice to be generally available. The right to access is couched in some bullshit language here. They should reflect on the possibility that theoretically you could potentially have the right to access. I mean, you can just put brackets around this bit or something. Put it in bold is what I usually do. Okay, then more recently, we have the recommendation for rights, services, and support for victims of crime. That effectively restates those key elements of the Council of Europe recommendation. It says this should be a generally available service, this should be open to everyone, and for standards, go back and look at the other recommendation. But what it does add is this phrase here, which is really, really important and is a big departure from the Victims' Rights Directive. The Victims' Rights Directive says that victims should be given information about restorative justice. Now, I don't know what that looks like in your countries, but in Ireland, you might get a flyer, and it's not a restorative justice flyer. It's, here's an encyclopedia of crap that we hope you don't really access, because it barely exists anyway. And if you want to access restorative justice, doesn't matter. So that's giving information. But what this says is that victims should be given the information and the support necessary to decide if restorative justice is right for them. That phrase, information and support, I think is really important, because what that implies to me is a conversation with the people who would facilitate the restorative justice were it to go ahead. That is what support looks like. That is what accessibility means, is not just, there's the website, here's a flyer, but you have access to a conversation that gives you that information. Okay, moving on then to European Union level, and as you probably know, there was a Victims' Rights Directive in 2012 which makes some mention of restorative justice. It basically says that if restorative justice already exists, and doesn't matter if it does or not, people should receive information about it, and it has to adhere to certain standards. So the process of revising that has been ongoing for a number of years, since around 2021, and that is yet to conclude. So I'm just going to tell you where we are at with that process. So the first thing that's really important is to say that the European Forum for Restorative Justice and Victim Support Europe are aligned. And what they're aligned on is the following: that the new directive should establish a right of access to restorative justice. This is the European Forum's proposal. This is Victim Support Europe's proposal. That is a very, very significant development, because there are probably victim services in your countries that have questions about this and which are members of Victim Support Europe. Victim Support Europe themselves have come quite some distance on this because of work by the European Forum and other people. Collaborative work that resulted in Victim Support Europe in their model provisions drafting a right of access to restorative justice. So those of you who have victim support organizations that you want to work with, that you want to talk about this more, Victim Support Europe, I think, is a good resource for you in that regard. So, and what time have I got until, Pia? Sorry?
You have about 25 minutes.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so this was the European Commission's proposal. The European Commission did not propose a right to restorative justice. What it proposed was that there should be basically national action plans on all victim services to make sure that victims have access. Okay? That's all you need to know from here, is that victims should have individual assessments supported by a national protocol so that all of the things to which they have a right are accessible. That was the European Commission's proposal. We then worked with the European Parliament to amend that proposal. So several committees, in particular the Committee on Civil Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs, the Committee on Women's Rights and Gender Equality, members of those committees, with our support, proposed a number of additional amendments, in particular that there should be a right to restorative justice. The current situation is that that has not been adopted into the latest draft. And in fact, the response from the Council of the European Union to the European Commission's draft was to water down even this proposal further. So right now, the latest version says something to the effect of countries could maybe do a protocol if they want, and maybe you could try and I mean, yes, and that's kind of funny, I suppose, but look, there's probably going to be something to this effect in there, and the consequence of that is it will be sufficiently, it will effectively not be binding. It will effectively not be binding on member states to actually introduce something like this. It will be up to multi-agency collaboration to encourage states to sponsor a process of this kind. Okay, good. So that's what I'll tell you about the European legal framework at the moment. I suppose two very small things. The first thing is that the European Commission will also then produce a victim strategy, 26 to 2030 probably, and there will be an opportunity to advocate for the greater inclusion of restorative justice in that. And that will be one of the major pieces of work that the European Forum for Restorative Justice's policy network will take forward. So please do try and engage with that when you can. So outside of the Nordic countries, there have been a very significant number of developments in restorative justice implementation in recent years. And in every country, this has looked quite different, right? So you're probably familiar, or you may be familiar with this film, this French film, Je vais tous les visages, which resulted in quite a significant interest in restorative justice in France, which was a country that basically had no services at the time. And so, you had something of a groundswell of demand for restorative justice that appeared because of this. Some of these are like real French actors, right? This was not like a niche thing. This was like, I don't know what the French for Hollywood is, but this was a mainstream movie in France. I include this image from Italy, which until a couple of years ago had a quite enlightened justice minister who undertook a very significant reform of criminal procedure and criminal justice in Italy, which foregrounded restorative justice. What I'm going to tell you a bit about is Restorative Justice Strategies for Change, which is the project that I was involved in. And I'm going to ask this question first of all. Who are all the different groups in your country, different groups of professionals whose support might be important to implement restorative justice in your country? Just shout them out. Who is that going to be? Police. Politicians. Courts. Youth work. Justice Department. Prosecutors. Schools. Lawyers. Social workers. Victim support. Media. Okay, prisons. Academics. Women's movement, okay. Probation hasn't been, well, I guess some places call it social work. Okay, great. Are they always present when you're having those discussions? Okay, I know they're not. I mean, I see the room is full. This is not meant to be a criticism of why aren't all the judges here. The judges, it's an interesting one in each country, because this is why it's very different in the countries, because the politics of these agencies interacting with each other can be very different in the different countries. I mean, in my country, in Ireland, the judges have a huge amount of political power, which they absolutely do not accept that they have, and which means that everyone is afraid of talking to them, but also, under the current system, they are the key people in referring to restorative justice or not. So that creates this ridiculous situation where even if everyone else is kind of working around this, the judges are never in the room, and they're the key people. But they're not the only key people. And in some countries it's the prosecutors, in some countries it's the police, and so on and so forth. And the project I'm going to tell you about, what it tried to do, or the question it asked was, what would it look like if we tried to come up with a national strategy with all of those people? So Restorative Justice Strategies for Change was a project that looked at implementing the Council of Europe recommendation of 2018. It involved 10 countries, no Nordic countries, unfortunately, sadly, because everything was already fine here anyway, right? It was the rest of us that needed to get our act together, as I explained earlier. And the premise was that a small number of people in each country would bring together a much bigger group of people in each country to come up with a national strategy. Now, this was a slightly unusual project in that we didn't have any funding for this. And so, effectively, it was just a voluntary, exercise to see what could we potentially do here. We reviewed this recently. It was a 5-year, really a 4-year project, because by the end, in the 5th year, there wasn't really a lot of activity. But over the course of the first year, what we found in the evaluation, which we completed recently, as I say, was that most of the participating countries managed to establish some form of strategy and managed to involve some representatives of most of those organizations that we discussed there. So, to review this, we drew on data including a survey of partners, and also each country was asked to produce an annual report talking about the work that they had done, specifically trying to distinguish between things that only happened because the project was in play and things which might have happened anyway. So we asked, to what extent and in what ways, if at all, did the project enable change? When it did, what were the mechanisms? And what were the implications for the development of restorative justice? And what we found was that that process of bringing together, intentionally bringing together as many key people as possible, seems to have had some benefits, including particularly for understanding each other's perspectives, understanding the work that each other do, right? Maybe this is different in some of your countries, but in every country I've ever worked in, police and probation don't really understand each other. Judges don't really understand prisons, right? Police don't really understand sentencing. Restorative justice and victim services don't have a great understanding of each other's day-to-day work necessarily, right? So what we found was 3 things. The first one was that working specifically with civil servants helped a lot of the people who were engaged in restorative justice advocacy to understand what were the day-to-day pressures of those civil servants, what policy making looked like, and therefore how they might engage with that process, both at times when that engagement was sought and when it wasn't. Secondly, there was some evidence that it helped to coordinate a wide range of professionals. And what that meant was that you had lots and lots of different doors that you could push on at different times. Maybe at a certain point, at a certain moment, you were not going to be able to get the police or the judiciary to play a greater role. But what you could do was work with other people at different points in the process. And so the concept that we're drawing on to help make sense of this is the concept of the community of practice. Bring together lots and lots of different people who have a shared interest in a specific topic to explore what, if anything, they can agree on and how they can work together to move it forward. I'm just going to describe a couple of projects very briefly. One which is ongoing right now. This is a project which is looking at the data protection question. So I don't know, is that a big issue for you guys? How easy is it for you to get victim contact details? Is that just fine, is it? Put your hands up if it's easy for you to get victims' contact details. Tell me more about that. What does that look like? Yeah. And who's given you that? In the police system. And the police will automatically give that to you. You have access to the database. Okay. That is what we would call an embedded restorative justice provision. We don't have that in most European countries. We don't have that. You were going to say something there, sir? Yeah? Oh, he is the police. Oh, sorry. I am the law. Yeah. Okay. So in most European countries, most of the restorative justice provision is done by independent restorative justice providers of some kind. And the consequence of that, certainly since the introduction of GDPR, is it's very difficult to get access to victim contact details without a significant level of gatekeeping to that. So what we're looking at is countries where the restorative justice providers automatically have access, and I hadn't clocked Norway within that, so I might have to talk to you guys later. Oh, that was Denmark, sorry. But in Denmark, but we talked about that, didn't we?
I said that, that's why I said that the police they have the information, so the cases that are in the police, of course, they have the
Where the police also facilitate the cases. Ah, yeah, okay. Interesting. Okay, thanks for that. Thank you very much for that. Okay, yes, so I mean, I suppose what we're looking at here is countries where the restorative justice provider is a different organization. And we're looking at kind of the data protection questions around that and how to make it easier for independent restorative justice providers to access victim contact details. Okay, this is the final thing I wanted to note, which is all of the things that you can do in criminal justice with restorative principles outside of victim-offender dialogue. Okay? Anything that you might want to do is supported by the European legal framework. And these are just some examples of things that we have at least piloted in Ireland. In the left here, what we have is police community dialogue specifically targeted so that the police are participating in dialogue with minority ethnic communities. Up at the top here, in prisons, we have a project which is looking at dialogue between the person in prison and their own family when they are looking at coming out of prison. This project was a little different. It was that the bosses of all the prisons in Ireland, the governors, we call them, have been trained in restorative approaches for their own use internally. It was interesting because we were working with them to talk about, which applications would you like to prioritize? Do you want to use it for conflict between two people in prison, or do you want to use it, in the prison disciplinary procedure? And what they concluded was that they needed to use it among themselves because the most damaging conflict that they were involved in was among the leadership of the organization. So that was quite interesting. Down here, what you see is a project where we are using restorative practices to bring together the academic, policy, and practice communities to talk about the development of research and how to use research in policy and practice. So I suppose all of this just to say that the other lesson that I'm learning about implementation of restorative is that you can use this in almost anything that you're doing. I know there's a couple of people in the room who've also been doing stuff in this area. Linnea, would you describe very briefly the work that you're doing?
Yeah, sure. So we're trying to pilot, say we're on the pilot stage. We're trying a project called Sluta Fred, so Make Peace, which we're running in Sweden collaboratively with civil society and municipality and social services. So we're trying to develop restorative justice circles where we will have the circles with the people that are indirectly affected by, for example, a shooting in Sweden. We have a lot of those shooting. We have had examples of maybe suggested around the Quran burnings, which have created conflicts in the local community, or indeed maybe relatives with people that are involved in gangs. But we're very early. We're hoping to get the pilots off the ground now and during the autumn, and hopefully we'll be having some results in the beginning of next year.
Great, thanks. So look, just a couple of examples of things that you can do. I suppose, again, my argument is engage with everyone as widely as possible with a view to exploring what you can do with this, because it might be something that you didn't quite expect in the first place. This work with the governors of the prison service, that came out of nowhere. We were trying to do something else with them, and then suddenly there seemed to be an opportunity for this, ran with it, And the evaluation of that, which will be published soon, shows that they were doing some really interesting stuff with it, in fairness to them, even though they were super, super cynical about it at first. So you never know where the opportunity will be to do some of this work. So, yes, finally, implications, as I mentioned. Try and find a suitable structure to engage with as many people as possible to develop an action plan which is suitable for your circumstances. It will be totally different in every country. That's fine, because it depends on what the current situation is in your country and who is available to participate in what way. Some countries have these challenges around information sharing. Try to automate that, right? A right to individual assessment requires it to be an automatic process. And over here, I've said, consider these other proactive applications. What other conflicts are there, other harms are there that involve your criminal justice partners, but which are outside the criminal procedure? There may be opportunities to develop restorative justice by doing work in that area. And indeed, in Ireland, where there's a reasonably good understanding of restorative now, that has come from stuff which is not really restorative justice, but all sorts of other work that police and youth workers have done, which is not really about victim-offender dialogue. And then finally, please continue to showcase your work from the Nordic countries to the rest of the world to give us something to look up to. Thank you.